very warm welcome, Renée Ford from the Ruhr University. You're working on compassion and especially devotion in the Buddhist traditions, in the Nyingtik tradition. I am really grateful for having you on the podcast of the No Drama Dharma podcast for the University of Leipzig, the Center for Contemplative Traditions, sponsored by the Cancer Foundation. So wonderful to have you here, and I hope the listeners will get more insights on a central pillar of Buddhist practice, of contemplative practices, that is not technique as such, that is the mind state that you enter meditation with, often in these traditions, and that the traditions are absolutely steeped in. We can discuss more, we can find out more about the importance of devotion, Tibetan term mugu, of faith or trust, Tibetan term depa, and maybe also about the different kinds of implied the compassion and provisionary compassion and final compassion, like bodhicitta or Changshub-tsem. These, for example, this I think you worked on in the Nyingtik tradition. So
yeah. Thank you so much, Marco. No, it's lovely to be here. And this has been a topic of mine through my dissertation and even now, and it seems just to keep opening up on itself. So I appreciate being here today.
If we look into Tibetan traditions, and especially if you look at the Nyingtik traditions or the Nyingma as a school, it is unthinkable not to practice one's guru yoga. And even though the meditation manuals might just have a short hint at that and say, do your guru yoga firsthand or something, but it would be unthinkable of not devoting quite a lot of time to this practice and seeing this as the central pillar of one's meditation practice. If we have secular meditation practices, contemplations, then this is the first thing you would drop.
The guru yoga part.
Yeah, if you would draw from any kind of Buddhist techniques, if you would formulate a newly set up meditation practice to put out in the wild, if you draw from the Tibetan tradition, I think guru yoga and the emotional part even is the first thing you would drop. So, but why is this important?
Why is the devotion important?
Yeah, what does it mean?
Yeah, so maybe we start a little bit further back from guru yoga, because that can be a bit daunting, I think, sometimes when we think about devotion and the sense of being committed in a way that maybe feels very foreign if we're coming from a perspective of mindfulness or secular, someone who just walks into Buddhist practices or a mindfulness practice. It's like you hear this word devotion, especially in English, and I think there's a lot of hesitancy. But when we look at the word mugu, it's really a combination of two other words in Tibetan, is mupa and gupa. And mupa just really means interest. It's something, whatever takes one's interest to it. And so when we look at mindfulness practice, we're thinking about being mindful of something, that we're mindful of the object of meditation, whether it's the breath, whether it's an object, whether it's a mantra, whatever it is. And so immediately there's already this interest, this focus of the mind onto something. So I think if we look at this word from this perspective, it opens it up, and it doesn't seem to be such a maybe committed thing. That it's just a matter of the mind is able to focus on an object. And in the Tibetan sense, that mupa, it's immediately your mind is taking interest into it. And so we're building interest right away, whatever it is. And we've seen lots of studies on mindfulness practice. There's research done with mindfulness practice that there can be benefits. Not always. There are researches that are also saying that sometimes it can be problematic, but the mind can take interest and focus, and then that opens the mind to do other things. And so moving on from that, and you talked about guru yoga, and in some ways it's the same sort of interest, right? The mind is focusing on an object, the deity, right, which is infused with one's teacher, that one already has this relationship with, hopefully a beneficial, helpful relationship that has been properly established with ethical boundaries, and that it's that same interest. And what happens is that along the way, like if we're talking from a Buddhist path perspective, that interest can tend to grow and it can expand. And so that there can be a relationship that is continuously from, and maybe say a shamatha or shine practice, that is like a mindfulness practice, resting on an object. And then one is able just to take that same type of interest and it moves to a different object in a different meditation practice or a different performative act that we can also take interest or have interest while we do things. And so when we think about practices or doings, I like to expand out this sense of meditation as not just a mental thing, but also a physical thing, an embodied thing, that if walking around a stupa or offering flowers, there's an interest of the mind that is attached to that in the sense of somebody, maybe they're not even necessarily thinking about it right away, but they're doing something. There's some sort of intention, or like they're doing it for a reason, that there's an interest in the act. And so I think we can look at, when we talk about devotion, that's a big part of it, is this interest, and it can change. To move to the second part, the gupa, of meaning respect, that I think it just kind of brings this, a sense of awareness or a different sort of orientation, right? We think about going back to the offering flowers, or having a mindfulness practice, that there is some respect or some space to hold that makes it with intention, or there's a purpose for doing whatever it is. And so again, when we have some sort of intention and respect, I think maybe intention is a better word. We have that intention with the performative act of offering flowers or sitting down, focusing on an object. I think we have a tendency to recall or remember or create a connection with whatever it is that's happening in that moment. And then what I would suggest is that gets carried forward. The more that is performed, then the more someone resonates with what's going on, and maybe they start to notice, oh, this feels this way, or this feels that way. So when I think of devotion, I think of it in terms of that, of like, it's an interest and it's respect with some sort of intention going on. So it creates a different type of space of how we orient ourselves in those acts.
Mm-hmm. So you don't really see it as necessarily a process of like being like under the sway of a person, putting yourself under the sway of a person. I think that's often an understanding of devotion that leads also to hesitance of getting into this kind of practice or this aspect of practice, but also that brings up a lot of criticism from Western perspectives or general current perspectives upon like Buddhist teachers and their role within the system of practice.
Yeah, I think that's a very dangerous way of thinking about devotion, and we see the problems that have come about through, abuse. And I think it's a very interesting question and issue that comes up, because when you read texts such as Patrul Rinpoche's Words of My Perfect Teacher, or you read Dzongtsar Khyentse's The Guru Drinks Bourbon, right? They're very, very adamant about analyzing the teacher and taking an immense amount of time to be with the teacher, to check that that person is actually suitable to be your teacher. And so there's a lot of ethics involved. And I think but those can get overlooked when we see these very charismatic individuals ensconced in a community that maybe brings a lot of attention. I don't think the idea of devotion has ever been a sense that it's just to be succumbed by somebody's like flash, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is also interesting is that in other communities that maybe grow up with, within this culture of respecting lamas, respecting rinpoches, it's a different orientation. And it also causes problems, but there's just not a sense of having to question this devotion, that there's a sense of understanding that they're a Buddha, but yet I'm not sure. Maybe I'll stop there with it because I don't want to speak too broadly. But yes, devotion is never the sense of just blindly following after somebody because you feel like it or you're supposed to.
I think with communities, you also might have like social or structural implications that are not necessarily going to be part of the essential Buddhist teachings.
Yeah.
That also secure your position or role within a certain society, within a certain group of people that might be part of the thing, might be part of one's life, rather than might be absolutely conducive to high-end or tantric meditation practices where this is taught as a specific meditation. You have many, when we talk about guru yoga, we have many practices that are actually the guru yogas as sadhanas, practices to generate devotion towards characters that are not alive, not
Exactly.
physically present. That if you do your guru yoga towards Milarepa or Garab Dorje, then you actually don't have this whole thing of succumbing to a physical person with the fail-safe of also not having to deal with the shortcomings of this or that person.
Exactly. And I think it's also, when we're speaking in the context of guru yoga, and maybe we think of all practices, that the point isn't to kind of cultivate this sense of like rock star status for the teacher. It's for our own wisdom and our own transformation of our own mind and to understand our own qualities. And so I think it's always really important to keep that in mind if one practices guru yoga, or if one comes across these practices and starts to research them. And it's like, what is the purpose of guru yoga? Well, it is to help the practitioner, reach enlightenment. It's not about cultivating a special stardom for the teacher.
Yeah, and not the social uplift or general uplift of as a personal status in rising yourself. I think that's also a thing. If you have groups of people, there's like hierarchies that are established, and acts of visible acts of devotion might lead to an increase of status in these groups. Whereas sitting in your room and generating the idea of devotion, which has a lot to do with also opening up to a certain state of mind, is not something visible to others at all. When you did research the devotion in the Nyingtik tradition, and I've seen you worked on some text that must be from the Longchen Nyingtik tradition, or?
Yeah, so my manuscript that I'm in the process of working with is one of Third Dojupshin's Guru Yoga instructions. And so he's kind of giving some general instructions. And so he's part of the Longchen Nyingtik, right? He was a son of Dujum Lingpa. So.
Yeah, we came across him when I studied for the history of the Dujum Tessa tradition. We came across this apparently super famous son in the Longchen Nyingtik tradition, who must have been a great author and somebody who provided and Chikme Tempin Nima?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, he was like extremely instrumental in adding commentaries and liturgy for the Longchen Nyingtik tradition.
Yeah.
You worked now on a sadhana or also on explanations?
Yeah, I've worked on two instructions. So one of them was actually translated and published on the Lotsawa House. It's like the 12, it's a staircase to lotus light. And he's just kind of giving 12 different points about guru yoga practice. And then the other one that I've translated is just general instructions. And so it does in the text, it doesn't even name like which sadhana it refers to or something. It says that there was one of his students who was an artist made this request for commentary on the Guru Yoga instructions. And so he goes through it. And what's really interesting is that the majority of this text is actually a biography of his teacher, Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo. So it creates a really interesting platform from which to, he's really talking about cultivating devotion. And he's doing it through recalling his teachers, kind of like his CV in a way. It's like, where did he study? What did he study? His miracles, what were his visions and everything. So it's definitely not a sadhana. And then there's, it's just kind of commentary on in a very indirect way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is interesting that you touch upon this, the role of the Namtar, of the spiritual biography in actually a contemplative life, in the role of the biography in one's practice itself. Because I remember I've been talking recently to a scholar who mainly works in philosophy, and he's absolutely outstanding in this. And he said, well, these biographies are pretty boring to me, And I never thought about that because he's so much into like the philosophical systems. But then if you have a background in the practice traditions, you might actually be reading quite more biographies than you actually read text explaining systems of thought or systems of practice.
Mm-hmm.
And the classical way would be entering a long retreat, and your basic guidebooks would be the meditation sadhanas, then the commentaries to the sadhanas, and a whole stack of biographies it could turn out.
Yeah, exactly. And I just think it's also interesting that he is, you almost can see him recalling these little vignettes of his teacher, and because it's not very sequential. It feels a bit like, well, here's a little bit of this and here's a little bit of this, but I almost see the effects of his own practice through this writing, because he's demonstrating his devotion in such a deep sense by recalling what he does recall, and then even recalling his what I call felt sense about how he feels when he's with his teacher. There's a line in there that even he says, I feel, whenever I'm around my teacher, I feel happy. And then he talks about other people coming by and saying that, well, even the biggest doubters, when they were in his presence, would change their mind, or they would recognize like the specialness of this individual, and, something would happen for them. So it's really a demonstration of his own embodied devotion that he has created, that he's had.
One part that might play into this is, for the traditions, the necessity of a living tradition, of like you have the Lungyiche, the Agama, and the transmitted teachings, or the teachings transmitted by the voice, but you also have in the Tibetan tradition, you have the Tokpiche, as we explained, the Dharma of realization that is transmitted from person to person as a living experience, or better say realization, and that actually is inherent to the person, that also is communicating in different ways. Like when you say happy with the teacher, it also means that the physical presence of the teacher, not just the teaching, like, hey, we sit down, I teach you, and like there's a certain topic, like
Yes.
what we do in a university, but there's the whole, maybe sometimes more, sometimes less, but the whole situation of spending time together and learning from an individual how this so-called enlightened individual might actually perform certain daily chores, or might relate to certain problems, and then this would be absolutely part of the learning phase. I think if one was exposed to such a close relationship, and this is often a topic in the biographies, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I think it's a really important part of the whole, maybe we say devotion process. And, psychologists have studied this too with children and parents, and this mimic resonance of that when we really do a lot of learning when we're in the presence of others. And I think what you described is part of this mimic resonance that we just really, that enlightened qualities, we'd say, right, of doing helpful things comes from being around people who are helpful or who are genuinely, happy with themselves or can be very present. That we can't just learn that from books or from reading or hearing a teaching.
Yeah, this is why I think it's important in the whole setup of, or in the whole succession of podcasts that I will do for the center, is that I try to slightly illuminate different points of contemplative practice. And there's so many easy, accessible points that are about a certain technique or a certain text. But then there is devotion and guru yoga that is kind of sometimes, it's everywhere, but it's not something that is like having, you do have manuals, but it doesn't have like the thing to do to have devotion, because it's something that accompanies and grows with everything. But then when you look at the Dzogchen or Mahamudra transmissions, and if you go further, even the Madhyamaka traditions, then you would have it as such a central practice. You would have it as your sadhana, but also it's the integral part of life.
Yeah, exactly.
But then there's also, I think, this dimension of devotion, dimension of guru yoga is also feel that, as you said before, with these large gatherings or large communities, that is prone to so many misunderstandings and also prone to so much damage that has faced up. I mean, the damage is resultant from behaviors. It's not coming from nothing, but so much damage that has occurred to the spread of Western Buddhism right now. That why it also has become a little bit difficult subject to touch even, I think they don't want to go into the matter too much.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, one thing that has come out of this is that because the West has dealt with these abuse cases, that it has also opened up, similar cases throughout Asia. And I think in the end, that's beneficial for everyone, because I don't think it's there's these issues. And I'm always trying to find ways to maybe tread carefully to respect the fact that, people have been put into very horrible situations because of the poor relationship between the teacher and the student. And then at the same time, make some space for devotion or this sense of cultivating a relationship with a teacher can also be beneficial. And I don't have an answer as to how to solve this problem, of course, but I think the more we can discuss and truly understand what it means to have devotion in this context of Buddhist practice, when there's, Tantra involved, or whether there's Guru Yoga practices, or there is a student-teacher relationship that is close, or maybe even not close. I think that just bringing this awareness kind of makes more space for recognizing the ethics that are also that are involved, that are not just a text thing, but they have to be lived. So it's a delicate matter, but it doesn't mean that we should keep away from it, from understanding what devotion is, because I think people are going to always be interested. We're always drawn to other people. I mean, that's partly the success, right, of student-teacher relationships. That's partly the success of Tibetan Buddhism, right? It's because it's working with human beings and it creates this link. and it's been perpetuated, and we've seen it grown throughout the world now, and it's not going to go away. There's always going to be another individual that's going to draw other individuals. And so, yeah, making this to understand that these types of relationships, I think, is really important.
One of the problems is that in such a setting, people would have to have a lot more information than you have as a beginner. But you would need that beforehand, because often the traditions or the scriptural traditions also provide these information, like points of a Vajra master, the requirements to actually perform or to be in such a position as a teacher. But of course, often people don't know these kind of requirements beforehand. At the same time, it takes a lot of study or a lot of understanding of the Buddhist tradition also to, once having heard about this, to actually know what this might mean in context.
Yeah.
Even the tradition has a lot of fail-safes. It also does present a lot of excuses, like Kongtrul mentions, if you see your teacher doing this, if you see your teacher lying. And so it seems like such a problematic situation has occurred many times. And there was kind of the wish to make people not lose their faith, even though the behavior of the teachers wasn't up to the standard. But then you also have instructions like in the preliminary practice of the Karmakagya, you would say that when it comes to visualizing the teacher, that only from the point of having actualized the nature of the mind, one would stop visualizing the teacher as Vajradhara, but visualize him in human form, in his present form, because this confidence or this conviction has been established that the teacher is representing the enlightened state. So that's very far, actually, very far at the point in practice that the visual aspect or the meditative aspect of the teacher should actually take the physical aspect of the teacher that we see with our own eyes. And before that drastic change in mind, actually, there's this might be a decades-long phase, and that practitioners are actually advised to use an abstract form of the teacher, a form that's just representing enlightenment, in order to stay safe from identifying too much with the person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think you bring up a really key point here, in the sense that it's a long process. And I think it's also a process of which probably wouldn't work if somebody has experienced, deep sense of abuse. And then it becomes on a very individual basis. And I think then that goes back to the sense, well, the point of these practices, again, is for the individual's benefit, right? So it's kind of it's really difficult to kind of paint a really broad sweep over everything.
But what are the initial instructions if you start, when you say you looked at the build-up of devotion in the Nyingtok tradition? What are the initial steps? You say you explained it in the beginning from a very broad perspective, like taking an interest. But what do the texts say? What do the traditions say themselves? How to get into that?
Yeah, so that's the funny thing, is that the text, I mean, because I've been studying Guru Yoga texts, so I can't speak to all the texts out there, obviously. But the text that I have looked at, it just says you have to have devotion. Like, devotion is the step. And if you don't have it, it's not going to work. I mean, the third Dodrup Chin says this over and over again, especially in like the first few pages of his text. And then he doesn't tell you how to cultivate it. He then goes into the instructions of, Guru Yoga practice. Imagine everything is a copper-colored mountain. You become Vajrayogini. Your teacher is there. And then he gives different instructions on how to visualize your teacher. So that's the funny thing, is that from what I'm coming across, it doesn't tell you how to cultivate devotion. It just says you have to have it. And so that's been the thing that, well, there's been two things. It's like, how does this devotion function? And then there's no instruction on like how to cultivate it. It has to it's this thing that kind of comes from within. And I think that's, the how is this sense of bringing one's attention back to an object. And that, when we're speaking in the context of Guru Yoga, that object becomes an enlightened being, no matter how it shows up, right? We've talked a lot about human teachers, and that's very typical for Longchen Nyingtik and Tibetan Guru Yoga sadhanas, right? That Buddhas appear in human form, but it's really about taking a enlightened form and having that mimic resonance to somehow understand that one's own enlightened qualities are there and to recognize them. But it's like you're doing it through doing it. It's not through, you can't do it through thinking it. And I think, that's kind of always the crux I hear. It's my own teachers talking about Dzogchen or something. It's like, you can't do it. You can't effort your way into doing it. It's going to happen. And you have to relax into it. And I think there's a little bit of that with Guru Yoga, is that you're going to just do and do and do and do and relate and connect to this practice, which connects you to other things. And eventually it's going to show up. And I'm maybe more out of a secular example is I used to be a professional ballet dancer. And the one thing I always noticed in ballet, there's a lot of doing. There's a lot of standing in first position and a tendu. And then you keep doing it and you're not really thinking about it. And then all of a sudden you can stand up on stage and you're performing and you're doing the ballet. And I think it's the same for devotion. No one can tell you how to do it. It's going to happen, if the pieces are in place and you keep doing something and then it shows up. So I don't have sense of like, this is what the texts say.
Yeah, but this is exactly, if the text don't say, that's also just part of the statement or part of what is interesting for us to get into.
Yeah.
I do see there's a certain reenactment in this, a reenactment of the practitioner sort of placing himself in front of the Buddha.
Mm-hmm.
And a reenactment of, you might see an actualization of the situation. You would have like the past story of the Buddha teaching his disciples. And I would say the practice of Guru Yoga as a meditation, as a contemplative practice, puts the person into the situation of actually being faced to the Buddha, mm-hmm. and aims to establish a directness.
Yes.
Which otherwise might be not accessible. So, in fact, the teacher being identified with the Buddha, but also past teachers being identified with the Buddhas, as I said before, Milarepa, the Karmapas, Guru Rinpoche, Garab Dorje, etc., Tsongkhapa, they all are seen as the Buddha in present. And the practitioner suddenly, in a very direct way, is faced with the Buddha.
Yes.
Also, this as a practice, I think, even though there's not much talk about it, I imagine it being an aspect that establishes this necessary directness, but in a practicable way. Suddenly, the Buddha doesn't become a distant figure from a distant story, but in one's own life and readily available at all times, becomes a contemplation of being in direct contact with the Buddha and thus one's Buddhahood.
Yes, exactly. And I think an important part of that, like directness, is also imagining oneself as a deity as well, right? Like in the Nyingma tradition, Longchen Nyingtik tradition, you're Vajrayogini. And so that creates another kind of mirroring for, in Nyingma it was Guru Rinpoche and Vajrayogini. And so it works with that relationship as well. That there's that directness. And so I think sometimes, because we are humans and we can oscillate between that sense of these two enlightened beings as ourselves and as our teacher. And then with time, they become more suffused with understanding our own way of being, in a sense. And so, yeah, it's taking very different types of elements and putting them all together in this very direct way of seeing, like you just described. And I think it can become very effective, right? Because it's working with not just like our cognitive understandings, it's like also work, it talks in the text about Vajrayogini seeing Guru Rinpoche. It's like this sense of pleading, see me with compassion, of like, it's really working with that felt sense again. And I don't think it's just a feeling or emotion thing that we say, but it's just like our whole body, like we feel things, and it incorporates that. And I think that's a big part of the devotional act as well.
It's maybe also important to mention that the understanding in many times in the Tibetan tradition of Guru Yoga can be boiled down to the Tibetan Naljor, Naldu, Chorwa uniting with the Nalma, with the natural aspect or uncontrived aspect. And this, I think, has very little to do with fascination, but with making accessible one's Buddha nature, making accessible the essential part of every being's mind, and the guru being the outer mirror or catalyst to bring that forth, and not by, as you said before, rock stardom, where you kind of really venerate a person for that person's quality and being like really stunned, but actually establishing a situation where it belittles the person practicing because the other image is so big and so wonderful. Like,
yeah,
you go to a rock concert, and like you're in a stadium and you have like these figures blown up on a screen, like superhuman, and you're one of those tiny dots between all these other tiny dots, and being like so amazed. But that doesn't seem to be it. There seems to be rather coming out of this deep self-depreciation and a lifting up to gaining the full experience and the full understanding that the opposite has.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, earlier you mentioned these two words, confidence, which I would say is from the word yiche in Tibetan, and then conviction, like dang. And it is exactly this sense of like one becomes so confident in their own Buddha qualities that shines forth. Or there's this conviction that, yes, I will reach enlightenment, or yes, I will be a Buddha, or I am a Buddha. And so you're able to take up space as a Buddha, as a Buddha in the world. I think, Anne Klein writes a book called Being Human and a Buddha Too. And I think that title of that book is just really speaks volumes to what it is for Guru Yoga practice and practice in general, that we are human beings. From the Buddhist tradition, it's understood that we have Buddha qualities. They're right there. We can tap into it at any time, where it's not something other than ourselves. We don't have to go out and get it. We have it. We have to recognize, to have that confidence and conviction. And that's what Guru Yoga is doing, right as you were talking about. It doesn't belittle us. It brings us up on the same page as with, teachers of past or future or present and enlightened beings.
There are quite different Guru Yoga practices. Some are very focused on devotion, outer devotion, you might say, saying prayers. And it's maybe more alien to the Western audience, but to the Tibetan audience, it's not a problem at all to shed tears and like be really almost dissolving into a very emotional state of longing to be blessed, longing for the Chinlap and for be touched mentally and or physically even. These practices exist, but at the same time you have very abstract practices where it's just a short visualization and then an inspiration to rest in a natural state of mind. And this being the Guru Yoga, generally the first ones would be considered more the outer. Then you have an inner Guru Yoga that might be having more practice aspect, where you have a lot of more visualizations, maybe mantra practice or something to do as a yogic practice. And then you would have the absolute Guru Yogas that are kind of really almost based on the actual experience of natural states of mind.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I remember the first time I was in Gangtok translating, I was translating these texts, and I started to walk around and I just recognized, well, everything's devotion. I'd sit there in front of the Tupu's office door, and people would go in to ask for blessings for this and that and bring offerings. And of course, people offering katas or offering money. And I just thought, oh, all of this is devotion. Like, this is not just simply about the guru yoga practice. And I think that really opened my eyes. And I think there's something to be said for that. We all relate to devotion. We all relate to Buddhism differently. And so I think it can be maybe difficult sometimes for us to pull them all together or understand where everything fits. But I see a direct linkage of that, doing these very, what you called, outer practices of devotion. I think they're very integral to doing more contemplative or inner practices. It's like that maybe we have to almost reimagine what it means to do a guru yoga sadhana. If it's just in isolation of everything else, that, maybe it's functioning differently if somebody's not doing all the outer practices of offering flowers or something like this. I don't know. I haven't really explored that, but I think there's probably something there. We talked about this being in the presence of a teacher and how that might influence us. And so I think it speaks to that as well.
Maybe within the Tibetan communities, I don't want to say not, that's not possible, but maybe also in the Western communities, also what we often consider as contemplations, meditations, are not the only part to go along the path, and being a devotee or being devoted and acting out of devotion is seen as the practice itself, or as practice guiding through life, even for people who might not actually have the chance, either by outer conditions or by their own mental setup, to engage into sitting practices, to engage into what we consider like proper meditation. I think we often have this idea of like there's kind of cultural stuff and proper meditation, and there's a whole overarching sphere that actually is part of the tantric traditions that connects people and that changes their states of mind without being a sitting meditator.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we've kind of come to this crux of where we are with meditation research, in the sense of, for so long, mindfulness has become at the fore and beyond Buddhist studies, right? It's used in psychology and neuroscience and everything. And there are neuroscientists who are, I was reading this article by Antoine Lutz and a few other authors, and saying there's so many practices we'd include into meditation, but then when we talk about the definition of meditation, we don't really have a defined meditation definition that includes everything. And I think we're finally getting to this point where, okay, well, we thought it was these sitting practices. Well, it's not in of those cells, because there's more to it. And I'm hoping that research can move beyond and look at meditation in very different ways. Like we're just saying, it's like embodied or felt sense or just performative. There's just a wide range of things that are done that can influence the mind in the way that we have discussed. And I think they're all equally deserving of attention.
Yeah.
And implementation. Yeah.
Maybe it's also because often we tend to think very result oriented. And I think for a certain kind of person, like mindfulness practice can yield very quick results in altering a general state of well-being, for example. That's like super evident. But let's say you have ADHD. All this won't work. Can't just tell a person with ADHD just sit down and relax. That's not. But a person with ADHD could very well, in the setting of like general tantric traditions, generate a lot of devotion.
Yeah.
And act within that sphere. And maybe that would create a ground to actually be able later to also sit down and do contemplative practices that are done sitting, for example.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. I always think of with my children that, when they start to get, I'd like them to calm down or something. And if there's been moments where, like, do you want to sit and practice with me? And they're like, no. And I just go, you can't get an 8-year-old to sit down. But then, they would circumambulate a stupa with me, or they make offerings of flowers or money to people who need money very easily. And it's like they're generating generosity and patience and in different ways. And they're maybe more effective. I don't know. But yeah.
And it also has to do with generating an atmosphere or ground in mind that actually makes other things possible. And
Exactly.
often when we have studies, these are left out as like the religious stuff. And it's very difficult to deal with that because you don't want to step on the religious turf, like say.
Yeah.
It's only because we see it as religion. The sphere of religion also in Western academia, I still believe, is very much dominated by the Christian idea of religion and religions as different spheres that are in concurrence. And then you have the concurrence of the different religions, and to step out of this, you have what you create as the secular. And once you go into what is called the secular, you're kind of safe, but you don't want to step on what is defined as religion. And I think that's it is very, very harmful for academia as such by now, because there are many really interesting aspects that people hesitate to go into, especially when it comes to Buddhism, when it comes to contemplative practice, because one is afraid to end up on the religious turf. And
yeah, I agree. And I think what's also very interesting is that I think in whether we say it's in academia or the secular world, we are seeing the limitations of what is occurring from trying to split certain things from other things. And I mean beyond the secular and religious. I'm talking because I think in this sense, when we look at like the human condition, that whether a human is religious or in a religion or in a culture, or they are living secularly life, the same kind of characteristics and patterns show up. I mean, I remember spending my first semester of theory of religious studies and talking about these secular spaces where we're seeing the same components that we would see in religious traditions, right? Like the sense of, you have American college football and the amount of religiosity that shows up in those spheres, or our American government. And I just keep using America just because I am American, and so I know those contexts much better than anything else. But like we see the same things coming up. It's like it would be really great to understand these things as human conditions, or maybe parts of our mind, epistemology of how we function in the world. They might show up in a religious context. They're going to show up in a secular context. And so we have to stop splitting things and understand it maybe from a more basic perspective.
Yeah, I think that's really it. We managed to discuss a good overview of the sphere of what Guru Yoga can be, what Guru Yoga is, how it's perceived in different subjects. And
yeah.
For today, thank you so much, Renée.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been lovely.